Chapter 7. The Burning Truth. The November wind carried the scent of wood smoke through Millbrook streets, a comfort smell for most residents, evoking fireplaces and autumn evenings. For Ian Martin, watching from his car 3 blocks from David Ortiz's house, it was the smell of success. The flames were beautiful in the dark, orange and gold against the black sky, consuming the modest ranch house with hungry efficiency. Ian had planned this one carefully, too carefully to fail. No more miraculous recoveries. No more impossible survivals. This time, he'd been thorough. 3 ignition points. Gasoline in every doorway, under every threshold. The front door blocked from outside with a 2x4 wedged against the frame. The back door lock jammed with superglue. Bedroom windows painted shut from years of deferred maintenance. David Ortiz, 52 years old, heavy sleeper, after long restaurant shifts, lived alone. No one to notice the smoke before it was too late. No one to call for help. Ian had entered through the back door at 2 a.m., moving silently through the darkened house. The smell of gasoline filled his nostrils as he poured it carefully. Hallways, doorways, splashing it liberally under David's bedroom door. He'd spent weeks planning this, studying David's habits, noting when he worked late, when he came home exhausted, when he slept most soundly. The man slept like the dead. Would sleep dead in a few minutes. Ian had taken his time setting up, methodical and careful. This wasn't like Thomas, no rage, no improvisation. This was calculated, controlled. The 2x4 wedged perfectly against the front door, making it impossible to push open from inside. The superglue hardening in the back door lock. 3 books of matches, 1 for each ignition point. He struck the first match in the living room, watching the gasoline catch with a satisfying whoosh of flame. Second match in the kitchen. Third in the hallway, creating a wall of fire between David's bedroom and any possible escape route. Then he was out the back door, running to his car, watching from 3 blocks away as the flames grew. Inside, David Ortiz woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling. For a confused moment, he thought something was wrong with the furnace. Then he opened his eyes and saw the orange glow under his bedroom door, heard the roar of flames consuming his house. He was on his feet instantly, heart hammering. Grabbed his phone from the nightstand. No signal, no time to call 911. Stumbled to the bedroom door and touched the handle. Burning hot. He jerked his hand back, understanding flooding through him with ice-cold terror. The door was the only exit. The bedroom windows were painted shut. He'd been meaning to fix them for years, had never gotten around to it, because he was always at the restaurant, always working, always too busy to maintain his own house. David tried the door anyway, yanked it open despite the heat, and was driven back by a wall of flame. The entire hallway was an inferno, impossible to pass. He slammed the door shut again, smoke already pouring under it in thick black clouds. The window. Had to be the window. He ran to it, tried to lift it. Stuck. Painted shut decades ago. The paint hardening into a seal stronger than glue. David grabbed a shoe from the floor and slammed it against the glass. The window cracked, but didn't shatter. He hit it again. The cracks spiderwebbed outward, but the glass held. Smoke was filling the room now, thick and choking. David wrapped his t-shirt around his face, but it barely helped. His eyes burned. His throat was raw. Each breath felt like inhaling fire. He kept hitting the window, desperate now. Panic, overwhelming reason. Why wouldn't it break? Why wouldn't it? The heat behind him was growing unbearable. David turned and saw flames licking under the bedroom door, smoke so thick he could barely see. He grabbed the bedside lamp, yanked it from the wall, and swung it at the window. The glass cracked further, but didn't break through. His legs were weakening. The smoke was too thick. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. David slumped against the wall next to the window, still holding the lamp, his vision darkening at the edges. His last coherent thought was of his daughters, Maria and Sophia, his beautiful girls, grown now and living their own lives. He hoped they knew he loved them. Hoped they'd understand he'd tried to escape. Hoped they wouldn't be too angry that he'd never updated his will, never fixed the windows, never sold that damn restaurant when Ian Martin first approached him. The smoke swallowed him, and David Ortiz died thinking of family. Ian watched the fire climb the walls, spread across the roof. Somewhere inside that inferno was David, the stubborn restaurant owner who'd refused to sell his family's building despite increasingly aggressive offers. The man who'd looked Ian in the eye just last week and said, "That restaurant was my parents' dream. It's my legacy. There's no amount of money that will make me sell it to you." Well, legacy didn't matter much when you were dead. The first fire truck's siren split the night, growing louder as it approached. Ian started his car and drove away slowly, carefully, like any concerned neighbour who'd noticed the fire and was heading home. No rushing, no panic, nothing to draw attention. By the time he reached his apartment, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by a deep, satisfied calm. This was different from the others. Eleanor had been clumsy desperation, pushing her into the bathtub without proper planning, relying on the water and darkness to hide his involvement. Thomas had been rage, hands and rope around the old man's throat. Margaret had been precision, but she'd somehow survived the poison he'd been certain would kill her. But David had been art, planning and execution in perfect harmony. No witnesses, no evidence connecting Ian to the scene. Just a tragic house fire, probable cause. Electrical malfunction, or maybe the carelessness of a man who worked too late and was too tired to notice a gas burner left on. Ian slept that night better than he had in weeks, dreamless and deep. 3 blocks from the charred remains of David Ortiz's house, Connor stood in the cold November darkness, staring at the smoking rubble as firefighters packed their equipment. Chief Rodriguez was speaking to the fire marshal, their voices low and serious. Connor had arrived too late, summoned by a text from Sheriff Morrison, who'd thought the doctor might want to know that one of his patients had died in a fire. By the time Connor reached the scene, David was already gone, his body recovered from near the bedroom window where he'd tried desperately to escape. Clear signs of arson, the fire marshal was seeing. Multiple points of origin, accelerant throughout. Doors were blocked or jammed. Whoever did this wanted to make sure no one got out alive. Connor's hands clenched into fists in his coat pockets. 4 murders now, 4 patients, 4 people who'd refused to sell their property to Ian Martin, 4 lives ended by a man who saw human beings as obstacles to profit. And Connor could bring them back. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. He could resurrect David, would resurrect David, the moment the fire marshal released the body. But how many more? How long before the pattern became too obvious? Before questions he couldn't answer drew attention he couldn't afford. 400 years of careful secrecy. And Ian Martin was going to expose everything through sheer murderous persistence. "Doc?" Connor turned to find Sheriff Morrison approaching, his face grim in the reflected light from the fire trucks. "I know he was your patient," Morrison said. "I'm sorry. From what Chief Rodriguez says, it was quick. Smoke inhalation before the flames reached him." Connor nodded, not trusting his voice. Quick or not, David had died in terror, trapped and burning, his last thoughts of the daughters who lived 2 states away and would now have to bury their father. Except they wouldn't. Not really. Because in 3 days, when the fire marshal finished the investigation and released the body, Connor would bring David back. And then the real hunting would begin. The county morgue at 3 a.m. was silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sounds of traffic on the highway. Connor stood over David Ortiz's body, the acrid smell of smoke still clinging to burned flesh despite the morgue's best efforts at cleaning. Fire deaths were different from drowning or strangulation or poisoning. The damage was written on the body in char and blister, in lungs seared by superheated air, in the defensive posture of limbs drawn up against the heat. David's body told the story of his last moments, the raised arm that had tried to shield his face, the position near the window where he'd made his final desperate attempt at escape. Connor had seen fire deaths before. In 1645, he'd watched burnings at the stake in Germany, had listened to the screams of accused witches, including one woman who'd actually been a healer with knowledge of herbs. Nothing more. In 1792, he'd pulled bodies from a London warehouse fire, trying futilely to save victims already dead from smoke inhalation. In 1888, he'd treated burn victims from a tenement fire in Chicago, watching children die despite his best medical efforts. Fire was one of the few ways to truly die in some of his past lives. Decapitation, fire, and certain forms of poison that destroyed the brain before it could regenerate. His necromancy could bring back bodies damaged by fire, but only if the brain remained intact enough to hold the essence of consciousness. David's brain was intact. Smoke inhalation had killed him before the flames reached his head. There was damage, yes, but nothing the necromantic energy couldn't heal once the spark of life returned. Connor placed his hands on David's chest, feeling the cold flesh beneath his palms. The morgue's refrigeration had lowered the body temperature to just above freezing. He would need to warm it first, coax the cells back to a state where they could accept life again. He closed his eyes and began to gather energy, pulling it from the air around him, from the earth beneath the building, from the small reserves he kept stored in his own body. Necromancy wasn't about creating life from nothing. It was about restoring what had been, calling back the pattern that death had disrupted. The incantation began in Latin, words he'd learned 300 years ago from a grimoire that had since crumbled to dust. Ex morte ad vitam, ex silentio ad spiritum, ex tenebris ad lucem, rede quod sublatum est. From death to life, from silence to breath, from darkness to light. Return what was taken. The energy built slowly, carefully. Resurrection required precision, required understanding exactly what you were calling back and why. Connor let his consciousness drift through David's neural pathways, reading the memories stored in dead synapses, understanding who this man was. David Ortiz, born 1973 in Millbrook. Mother Elena, father Roberto, both immigrants from Mexico who'd saved for 15 years to buy the building that housed their restaurant. David had grown up in the kitchen, learning to cook before he could read, understanding from childhood that the restaurant was more than a business. It was family, legacy, proof that immigrants could build something lasting in their adopted home. 2 daughters, Maria and Sophia. Divorced 5 years ago, amicable but sad. His ex-wife had wanted to leave Millbrook, see more of the world, and David couldn't imagine leaving the restaurant. They'd chosen different paths but remained friends. The girls visited for holidays, called every week, were his pride and joy. The restaurant, his parents' dream, now his responsibility. He'd modernized the menu, added online ordering, survived the COVID pandemic by shifting to takeout. Every day was a challenge, but every satisfied customer was proof that the Ortiz family mattered, that their contribution to Millbrook's community was real and valued. And Ian Martin wanted to demolish it, replace it with condos or retail space, something that would generate more profit per square foot. Ian had offered good money, great money, honestly, but David couldn't accept. The restaurant was his parents' legacy. It was his identity. Selling would feel like erasing his family from the town's history. So Ian had killed him? Connor felt rage kindle in his chest as he processed David's memories, understanding the full weight of what had been taken. This wasn't just murder. It was erasure, the destruction of family legacy for profit margins. He channeled that rage into the resurrection, letting it fuel the necromantic energy. Rede spiritum, rede vitam, rede memoriam, rede. The energy crested and released, flowing into David's ruined body like electricity finding ground. Connor watched as colour returned to grey skin, as burned tissue healed itself, as lungs reformed from seared flesh. The necromancy didn't just restore life, it healed damage, returned the body to the state it had been before death. For a moment, nothing happened. Then David's chest heaved, his back arching off the metal table as air rushed into restored lungs. And he screamed. The sound was raw terror, animal panic, the scream of a man still feeling phantom flames consuming his flesh. David thrashed, hands clawing at invisible fire, body twisting away from heat that no longer existed. Burning! It's burning! I can't breathe! The smoke! Maria! Sophia! His daughters' names torn from his throat between screams. David! Connor grabbed his shoulders, holding firm against the panicked struggling. David, listen to me. The fire is gone. You're safe. You're alive. Listen to my voice. The smoke. Can't breathe. Window won't break. David's words were choked gasps, his eyes wild and unseeing, still trapped in the moment of his death. There's no smoke. You're breathing clean air. Feel it. Cool air. No heat. No flames. You're in a morgue. The fire is out. You're safe. Connor kept his voice steady, calm, an anchor in David's psychological storm. It took 20 minutes of steady, calm reassurance before David's panic began to subside. His breathing slowed from hyperventilation to merely rapid. His thrashing stilled to trembling. Connor talked him through it, reminding him again and again, no fire, no smoke, safe, alive, breathing clean air. Finally, David's eyes focused on Connor's face, recognition dawning through the terror. Dr. McMasters? His voice was hoarse, raw. What happened? Connor helped him sit up slowly. What's the last thing you remember? David closed his eyes, and Connor saw him flinch from the memory. Fire. My bedroom was full of smoke. I tried to get out, but the hallway was... He stopped, swallowed hard. The window wouldn't open. I tried to break it, but I couldn't. I couldn't breathe. The smoke. He looked down at his hands, turning them over, as if expecting to see burns. I died. I know I died. You did, Connor said quietly. 3 days ago, house fire. The fire marshal ruled it arson. They found accelerant throughout your house. Both doors blocked or jammed. Someone wanted to make sure you didn't get out. David's hands clenched into fists. Ian Martin. Almost certainly. Then how am I? David looked around the morgue, at the metal drawers lining the walls, at his own bare chest, showing no signs of fire damage. How am I alive? How is this possible? So Connor explained. About necromancy, about the other murders and resurrections, about Eleanor and Thomas and Margaret, all living at his farmhouse, all hiding while they figured out how to stop Ian Martin without exposing what Connor could do. David listened in silence, his expression moving through disbelief, shock, and finally, surprisingly, a kind of pragmatic acceptance. When Connor finished, David was quiet for a long moment. Then, so, you're magic. Connor blinked. Of all the responses he'd received, that was perhaps the most straightforward. In a manner of speaking. You brought me back from the dead, and the guy who killed me is Ian Martin, the real estate asshole who's been harassing me for 2 years about selling my restaurant building. That's correct. David nodded once, decisively. Okay, what's the plan? Connor stared at him. Eleanor had needed weeks to process her resurrection. Thomas still struggled with PTSD flashbacks. Margaret had alternated between rage and existential crisis for days. But David Ortiz, apparently, was ready to move straight to tactical planning. You're taking this remarkably well, Connor said carefully. David shrugged. Look, Doc, you saved my life, literally brought me back from death. I can either spend weeks having a philosophical crisis about the nature of existence, or I can focus on the fact that a murderous bastard burned down my house while I was sleeping in it. I choose option 2. He met Connor's eyes steadily. I want to help stop this guy. Tell me what I need to do. At the farmhouse, David integrated into the group with surprising ease. The first morning, Eleanor had been wary, watching this new addition to their strange community with assessment in her eyes. But when David emerged from his room at dawn and immediately started making coffee for everyone, she relaxed slightly. You don't have to do that, she said from the kitchen doorway. David turned from the coffee maker. I ran a restaurant for 20 years. Making coffee is muscle memory. He paused, studying her. You're Eleanor. Dr. McMasters told me about you. The drowning. Yes, her voice was flat, daring him to pity her. That must have been terrifying. It was. Eleanor crossed her arms. How are you handling it? The death? The resurrection? David poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. I'm pissed off, he said bluntly. Ian burned down my house while I was sleeping in it. That's not something I'm going to forgive or forget. But sitting around having an existential crisis about the nature of death isn't going to help me get revenge, so I'm focusing on what I can control. Eleanor's lips twitched into something almost like a smile. Practical. I prefer to think of it as pragmatic. David took a sip of coffee. Dr. McMasters says you've been helping plan our next moves. I'd like to contribute if you'll have me. They spent the next hour at the kitchen table discussing strategy. By the time Thomas and Margaret woke up, Eleanor and David had sketched out the basics of what would become the open house plan. Thomas was harder to reach initially. The older veteran spent most of his time in his room or sitting silently on the porch, staring at nothing. Connor had explained about the PTSD, the flashbacks, the way Thomas would sometimes startle at sudden sounds or movements. David recognised it immediately. His uncle Carlos had come back from Vietnam a changed man, jumpy, prone to nightmares, unable to hold down a job for years. David had been 12 when Carlos finally started opening up about what he'd seen, what he'd done, what had been done to him. The second morning, David found Thomas on the porch in pre-dawn darkness. He sat down without asking, not too close, giving Thomas space. They sat in silence for 10 minutes before David spoke. "You got ghosts in your head?" Thomas didn't look at him. "What?" "Ghosts. Memories that won't stay buried. Hands around your throat that aren't really there." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Dr. McMasters shouldn't have told you. He didn't have to. I can see it. My uncle had the same look after Vietnam. Took him years to find his way back." "Did he?" Thomas asked quietly. "Find his way back?" "Yeah. Got into woodworking, found a therapist who actually understood, met a woman who didn't mind his rough edges. He died at 75 with grandkids who loved him." David pulled his coffee mug closer. It wasn't easy, but he did it. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I keep having nightmares. I wake up feeling like I'm being strangled." He trailed off. "Death," David finished. "I wake up smelling smoke. Can still feel the heat on my skin, even though the burns are gone." He held up his arms, showing unmarked skin that had been charred just days ago. "The body heals faster than the mind. How do you deal with it?" "I acknowledge it's there. I don't try to pretend I'm fine when I'm not, and I don't let it run my life." David looked at Thomas directly. "What happened to us? Dying, coming back? That's trauma. It rewires your brain. You don't have to pretend you're okay, but you also don't have to let it define you." Thomas nodded slowly. After that, he started spending less time alone. He joined the strategy sessions. He even smiled occasionally. Margaret was the most fragile, still weak from the antifreeze poisoning, even though Connor's necromancy had healed the physical damage. The poison had left psychological scars. She was afraid to eat anything she hadn't prepared herself, jumped at unexpected sounds, had panic attacks that left her breathless and shaking. David treated her with gentle courtesy, never pushing, always giving her control. He asked her opinion on meal planning, let her choose what to cook, made sure she felt safe in the shared space. "You remind me of my daughters," he told her one afternoon while they were preparing lunch together. "Same kind of strength underneath the fear." Margaret glanced up from chopping vegetables, surprised. "I don't feel strong." Strength isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. David rinsed lettuce in the sink. "You survived poisoning. You're here, helping us plan how to stop your killer. That takes courage." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so angry," she whispered. "I thought I'd moved past it, but I'm just so angry all the time." "Good. Be angry. Ian Martin tried to murder you. Anger is the appropriate response." David handed her a paper towel. "Use it. Channel it. Make him pay for what he did." And Connor. Connor found himself with an unexpected ally, someone who could think strategically and didn't freeze in crisis. They began planning together, late-night sessions at the kitchen table with coffee and maps of Millbrook spread between them. Eleanor usually joined them, her legal training, providing valuable insight into evidentiary requirements and prosecution strategies. But it was David who asked the questions that pushed their thinking forward. "Why are we waiting for him to kill more people?" David asked one night, 3 days after his resurrection. "We have 4 victims, 4 counts of attempted murder. That's enough to go to the police." Connor shook his head, explaining the complications. Public deaths, death certificates, the questions that would arise about how 4 people had survived what should have been fatal attacks. Investigations that might expose your necromancy, David summarized. "Yes." David drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. "So we need him to confess, or we need to catch him attempting another murder. Set a trap." "Using whom as bait?" Eleanor asked. "Me." David's expression was calm but determined. "I'm the newest death. My survival will hit him hardest. We stage my return, make it public, see how he reacts. Maybe he panics. Maybe he tries again. Either way, we get evidence. Connor frowned. That's dangerous. If he tries again? I've already died once this month, Doc. I'm not afraid of Ian Martin. David leaned forward. Besides, you said it yourself. His pattern is escalating. He's going to kill again soon. Better me, with backup and a plan, than someone you can't bring back. Eleanor nodded slowly. He's right. We need to be proactive, not reactive. We can't just hide here, waiting for Ian to murder more people. Plus, David added, I want to see his face when he realizes I'm alive. The bastard burned down my house with me in it. He deserves to be haunted by what he did. Connor looked between them, seeing the determination in their faces. They were right, of course. Hiding wasn't sustainable, but exposing David meant exposing the resurrections, meant increasing the risk that someone would start asking questions Connor couldn't answer. Still, David was willing, and the alternative was letting Ian continue his murder spree unchecked. All right, Connor said finally, but we do this carefully. We control when and where you reveal yourself. We have backup in place, and at the first sign of serious danger, you disappear again. David smiled grimly. Trust me, Doc. I've run a business for 20 years in this town. I know how to plan and execute. 2 weeks after the fire, David Ortiz walked into an open house Ian Martin was hosting downtown. The property was a commercial building near the square, a potential anchor for Ian's development plans. Everything was going perfectly. Ian had dressed in his best suit, had his pitch memorized, was showing a serious investor from Columbus around the space. The man represented a development group with deep pockets, exactly the kind of partner Ian needed to make his Millbrook vision a reality. As you can see, Ian was saying, gesturing to the exposed brick walls, the bones of this building are excellent. With proper renovation, this could become the centerpiece of downtown revitalization. Boutique retail on the first floor, professional offices on the second. Movement in the doorway caught his eye. A casual visitor, probably. Open houses attracted the curious. Ian glanced over, ready to smile and wave, to invite them in, or politely indicate he was busy with a client. The world stopped. David Ortiz, alive, smiling, examining the crown moulding with casual interest. Ian's voice died mid-word. The investor looked at him questioningly. Mr. Martin, is everything all right? No, nothing was all right. Nothing would ever be all right again, because David Ortiz was standing in the doorway, and David Ortiz was dead. Ian had killed him, had planned it meticulously, had poured gasoline through his house at 2 a.m. while David slept, had blocked both doors, had watched the house burn from 3 blocks away, had seen the fire trucks arrive, had read the fire marshal's report, had attended the community vigil where people shared memories of David and his family restaurant. There had been an obituary. Ian had read it, had sent a sympathy card to David's daughters, had already started planning his approach to buy the restaurant building from the estate. Yet there David was, flesh and blood, turning to meet Ian's stare with a friendly smile. Ian's mind fragmented. This wasn't possible. People didn't survive house fires after being pronounced dead. Bodies didn't resurrect themselves 3 weeks later and walk into open houses. This was hallucination, psychotic break, something wrong with Ian's perception of reality. But David looked so real, so solid, so undeniably alive. Ian, fancy seeing you here. Small town, right? That voice. Ian had imagined David's screams as the fire consumed him, had pictured his last moments of terror and pain. But here was David's actual voice, cheerful and normal, greeting Ian like a friend. Ian stumbled forward, his legs not quite working properly. His vision tunneled. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The fire. The investor was watching now, concern creeping into his expression. The perfect pitch, the crucial meeting, was falling apart because a dead man was standing in the doorway. David's brow furrowed in concern. Fire? Oh, you mean my house. He shook his head, still smiling. Yeah, that was terrible. Lucky I wasn't home that night. Stayed late at the restaurant doing inventory. Came home to find the place burned down. Not home. Wasn't home. But Ian had watched him come home at midnight, had waited 2 hours to make sure David was deeply asleep, had crept through the dark house, knowing David was in his bedroom. Had poured gasoline under David's bedroom door specifically to trap him there. Fire marshal says it was arson, David continued conversationally. Can you believe that? Who would do something like that? Every word was a knife sliding between Ian's ribs. The fire marshal investigation. The arson determination. The evidence of accelerant and blocked exits. They were looking for who had done it, and David was standing here alive, asking who would do such a thing, and Ian could feel reality crumbling around him. But the obituary, Ian whispered, his voice barely audible. David laughed. Actually, laughed. What obituary? Ian, buddy, you look pale. Are you feeling okay? He reached out to touch Ian's arm, concern evident on his face. Ian flinched back violently, stumbling into a floor lamp that swayed dangerously. The investor took a step back. Other people in the open house were staring now, whispers starting to circulate. Dead people don't touch you. Dead people don't reach out with warm, living hands. This can't be real. This can't be happening. Maybe you should sit down, David said, his concern sounding perfectly genuine. You don't look well. Ian ran. There was no dignity in it, no attempt to maintain composure or salvage the business meeting. He simply turned and fled from the open house, pushing past potential buyers, leaving his briefcase and the confused investor behind. His car was 2 blocks away, and he ran the entire distance, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. Not possible. Not possible. Dead people don't come back. Dead people don't walk into open houses, making casual conversation about arson investigations. He fumbled with his car keys, dropped them, picked them up with shaking hands, got the door open, collapsed into the driver's seat. His mind spun through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Maybe it wasn't David. Maybe it was a twin, a brother, a cousin who looked remarkably similar. But David had said, "My house," had referenced the fire, had known who Ian was. And there was no twin. Ian had researched David's family thoroughly before deciding to kill him. Maybe David hadn't been in the house. Maybe he'd left before the fire started, and the body the fire marshal recovered was someone else. But that made no sense. Who else would have been in David's house at 2 a.m.? And David had just said he stayed late at the restaurant, came home to find it burned, as if he'd been there after the fire was over. Time doesn't work that way. You can't come home after your house burns down if you were supposedly inside it when it burned. Maybe David knew. Maybe he'd somehow survived, knew Ian had tried to kill him and was playing with him now. But how could anyone survive what Ian had done? The gasoline, the blocked doors, the smoke and flames and heat. No one walked away from that. Ian sat in his car for 20 minutes, shaking, unable to drive. His phone buzzed. The investor, probably, asking what the hell had just happened. Ian ignored it. When he finally started the engine, his hands were still trembling. He drove home on autopilot, his mind replaying the encounter again and again. David's smile, his casual greeting, the way he'd reached out as if to offer comfort, the way he'd asked, who would do something like that, while looking directly at Ian, like he knew, like he wanted Ian to know that he knew, like this was some kind of game, some kind of psychological torture. Back in his apartment, Ian poured himself a scotch with shaking hands. He'd killed 4 people now. Eleanor, Thomas, Margaret, David. And somehow, impossibly, they kept surviving. Eleanor, drowned. Thomas, strangled. Margaret, poisoned. But hospitals could do miraculous things these days. Maybe the doctors had caught it in time. Maybe the lethal dose wasn't actually lethal. But David. There was no explaining David. Fire didn't leave room for maybe. Bodies recovered from house fires didn't resurrect themselves 3 weeks later. Unless... Ian set down his scotch, a new possibility occurring to him. What if none of them had actually died? What if he'd failed every single time? And they all knew what he'd tried to do. And they were coordinating somehow to drive him insane. But no, Margaret had been in ICU. Thomas's strangling had been thorough. Eleanor's drowning had been confirmed. David's body had been recovered from the fire. Yet, here they were. David and Margaret. Alive. Ian poured another scotch and drank it in one burning swallow. Somewhere in Millbrook, 2 of the 4 people he'd murdered were walking around, talking, living, potentially gathering evidence, building a case, planning to expose him, or worse, planning revenge. Across the street, Connor jogged past in his usual running gear. Another day, another routine run through downtown Millbrook. He didn't look towards the open house, didn't acknowledge David standing in the window watching Ian's panicked retreat. But David saw Connor's almost imperceptible nod and nodded back. Phase 1 complete. Jennifer Wu had been maintaining her private log for 3 weeks, and the pattern was undeniable. She sat in her car in the clinic parking lot after hours, laptop open, scrolling through her carefully documented observations. Eleanor Henderson, patient of Dr. McMaster's, drowned in bathtub, closed casket funeral, no body shown, approached by Ian Martin about selling lakeside property before death. Thomas Grayson, patient of Dr. McMaster's, strangled in home burglary, closed casket funeral, approached by Ian Martin about selling auto shop. Margaret Chen, patient of Dr. McMaster's, poisoned, critical condition, miraculous recovery despite lethal arsenic levels, approached by Ian Martin about selling her home. David Ortiz, patient of Dr. McMaster's, died in house fire, pronounced dead at scene. Death certificate issued. Despite fire marshal's report, a witness states David approached Ian at an open house. David was approached by Ian Martin about selling his restaurant building. 4 patients, 4 deaths, 1 confirmed survival, 1 rumoured survival, all connected to Ian Martin, all with Connor McMaster's at the centre. Jennifer closed her laptop slowly. She'd been a nurse for 15 years, had worked with Connor for 2. She knew him, professional, competent, genuinely caring, not the kind of man who would be involved in anything illegal or unethical, but she also knew that such things defied all logic and medical understanding. People didn't recover from lethal poisoning. They didn't survive drowning. They didn't walk away from house fires after being pronounced dead, unless someone was making them survive, or committing fraud. The question was how and why. Jennifer found Connor in his office after the clinic closed, reviewing patient files. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, closing the door firmly behind her. Connor looked up, surprised. "Jennifer, I thought you'd left for the day?" "We need to talk about the resurrections," she said bluntly, sitting down across from him. Connor's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, calculation, assessment. "I'm not sure what you mean." Jennifer opened her laptop and turned it toward him, showing her log. 4 patients, 4 deaths, 1 miraculous survival, 1 rumoured survival, all connected to Ian Martin. And you, always there, always involved, always with explanations that make just enough sense that nobody questions them. She leaned forward. "I don't know how you're doing it, if you're hiding them, if you're faking their deaths, if there's some medical explanation I don't understand. But I know something impossible is happening. And I know you're at the centre of it." Connor studied her for a long moment. She could see him weighing options, considering responses. He could deny everything. He could gaslight her, make her doubt her own observations. He could threaten her job. But Jennifer had known Connor for 2 years. She'd seen how he cared for his patients, how he went above and beyond standard care, how he seemed to take every death personally. She trusted him, and she thought, hoped, he trusted her. "If I told you the truth," Connor said slowly, "it would change everything. You couldn't unhear it, and it would put you in a very complicated position." Jennifer didn't hesitate. "Tell me anyway." Connor was quiet for another long moment. Then, carefully, he began to explain. About necromancy, about Ian Martin's murders and the resurrections, about the 4 people currently hiding at his farmhouse, all alive but legally dead, all waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Jennifer listened without interrupting. Her expression cycled through disbelief, shock, and, gradually, acceptance. Connor showed her proof. Photos of the resurrected patients at his farmhouse. Death certificates, newspaper clippings about the deaths. When he finished, Jennifer was quiet for a long time. Connor waited, watching her process information that should be impossible, trying to assess whether he'd just made the biggest mistake of his 400-year existence. Finally, Jennifer spoke. "Show me." "What?" "Show me. I need to see it to believe it. Take me to them." Connor hesitated. Jennifer. You're asking me to believe in magic, in resurrection. I need proof beyond photos and documents. I need to see them, talk to them, confirm they're really the people who supposedly died. She had a point. Connor had provided evidence, but evidence could be fabricated. Jennifer was too smart, too analytical to accept something this impossible without direct verification. Tomorrow night, Connor said. I'll take you to the farmhouse. But Jennifer, once you see this, you're part of it. There's no walking away. Jennifer met his eyes steadily. I don't want to walk away. If Ian Martin is killing people, he needs to be stopped. And if you're doing something impossible to stop him, then I want to help. Connor felt relief wash over him, the relief of sharing a burden he'd carried alone for centuries. All right, tomorrow night, but we do this carefully. I've kept this secret for years. I'd like to keep it a little longer. Jennifer smiled slightly. Doctor-patient confidentiality extends to the doctor too, right? Your secrets are safe with me. That night, Connor stood in his farmhouse kitchen, looking out the window at the dark fields beyond. In the living room, David and Eleanor were discussing strategy, while Thomas tried to teach Margaret a card game. 4 people who should be dead, alive, because Connor had brought them back. And now Jennifer knew. The secret was spreading, the circle of knowledge widening. Every person who knew was another potential point of failure, another risk. But it was also, Connor realised, a relief. For 4 centuries, he'd stood alone against the weight of his curse and gift. Now he had allies. People who knew what he could do and accepted it. People who wanted to help rather than expose or exploit. His phone buzzed. A text from Sheriff Morrison. Ian Martin called station tonight, rambling about David Ortiz being alive. Dispatcher thought he sounded disturbed. Thought you should know. Connor smiled grimly. Ian was cracking. The psychological pressure was doing exactly what Connor hoped, pushing him toward mistakes, toward actions that would expose him. But Ian was also dangerous. A man who'd committed 4 murders wouldn't hesitate to try again. They needed to move carefully, but they were moving. Finally, after weeks of hiding and planning, they were taking action. The haunting had begun, and Ian Martin's carefully constructed world was starting to burn.